Welcome everybody to this webinar from the American Nuclear Society's Risk-Informed Performance-Based Principles and Policy Committee, RP3C we call it. My name is Prasad Kadambi and I am chair of RP3C. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. Modernization has come to mean that risk-informed and performance-based methods are employed to overcome the difficulties that we all know about with purely deterministic and prescriptive methods. We've been calling these methods RIPB approaches, and this set of methods has received recognition in the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act. And so it has higher importance, I believe, these days. There is a lot of guidance available on RIPB approaches, but most people have not had reason to become familiar with the guidance because the conventional approaches still dominate most things that we do, including standards development. Right now, ANS has been, providing these opportunities for people to share their knowledge and experience and the practices that they employ in the modernized methods. And, I'd like to point out that even though lately we've been covering a lot of new reactor and advanced reactor methods, we do want to apply these modern methods to all the standards that ANS works on. So if you're working on any standard, and you're implementing risk-informed and performance-based approaches, I invite you to let me know and we can arrange for a presentation that can describe what you do and get more people perhaps interested in what you're doing. So right now, we run these on the last Friday of every month. Today we have Kyle Metzroth from X-Energy, who is actually providing a repeat performance. The last time that he spoke for us on RP3 on this webinar, it was a real hit comparatively. And so, I look forward very much for the update that Kyle is going to provide about the X-Energy project. Thank you. Kyle, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Prasad. Just to confirm, you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Good. Burned by technology too many times today. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us on a Friday afternoon. As Prasad mentioned, my name is Kyle Metzroth. I'm the Safety Analysis Manager for the Xe-100 project. I'm also responsible for implementing the NEI 1804 process, which is the risk-informed licensing process that was endorsed by the NRC a few years ago. So what I'd like to do is go through basically our status on the implementation of NEI 1804 and lessons learned. And there are a few select topics that I want to go through in particular. We've actually covered a lot of ground in our 1804 implementation, so I can't cover everything. But I'd like to at least hit on a couple points that I thought it was important to share with the community. So I'll go first, just a brief overview of the Xe-100 design, then a brief overview of 1804 itself. I mean, I know this is a risk-informed community I'm talking to here, but I don't necessarily know everyone's background with 1804, so I'll give a very cursory overview, and then we'll get into what we've been up to recently. So just a brief overview of the Xe-100 itself. I'm sure that people have, probably know enough about it from, things you've seen publicly. But, the Xe-100 is a pebble bed modular reactor, 200 megawatts thermal, and based on, sorry, folks don't mind going on mute. There's some background noise I got a second ago. So based on TRISO fuel technology, and the TRISO fuel is where a significant amount of the safety case lies. So this figure on the right, shows the reactor and steam generator design. This is our primary system. So the pebble bed sits in the center here. with graphite reflectors. The flow travels down, through the pebble bed, down into this cross vessel, and then into a helical coil steam generator, and then back up an upcomer, and then back into the reactor vessel. 2 helium circulators, a fuel handling system, which continuously refuels the reactor. And then we also have a, not shown in this picture, is a reactor cavity cooling system, which is our safety related means of removing heat in the case of a design basis accident. The plant has been designed to rely on inherent safety. So there are no active components required in order to demonstrate acceptable performance and under accident conditions, both in terms of heat removal as well as reactivity control. So that's a brief overview of the design. I'll go now briefly into 1804 itself and the licensing modernization program pilot. So for those who are not familiar with NEI 1804, this was an outgrowth of the NGNP project, and then there's some work that Southern Company spearheaded to develop essentially what is an approach for licensing the next generation of reactors, particularly non-light water reactors. And so it really sought to cover 3 major areas. One is, how do I select the events, right? Historically, events have been selected, kind of been based on experience and what we consider to be important. But for these new designs, we don't have that experience to draw upon. So what's the right systematic way in order to select licensing basis events? Secondly, how do you classify structure systems and components, right? So again, there's a lot of historical approaches that have been developed based on the current light water reactor fleet, and with the totally different technologies that are being planned for the for the generation 4 next generation reactors. A lot of those methodologies don't work so well. And so, what is a more technology inclusive way of classifying SSCs? And then finally, what is a systematic way to evaluate defense in depth? So, defense in depth in the classical context with light water reactors is very, working from the fuel out to the containment. However, if you consider the Xe-100 design, for example, like the containment is actually the fuel. And so there's a different way we have to think about defense in depth. And so again, more of a technology inclusive way to do that. 1804 also has some roots in the ANS 53.1 standard that was developed out of some of the earlier high temperature gas reactor programs. But this was all brought together, all the experience in this kind of approach brought together and codified in NEI 1804, hence why I'm calling it the NEI 1804 process. That was developed back in 2019, and then in Reg Guide 1.233, the NRC endorsed it as an acceptable means to perform those 3 tasks that I just mentioned, which is develop licensing basis events, classifying SSCs, and evaluating the adequacy of defense in depth. So I'll go briefly through those elements and just talk about them at a high level. So licensing basis events, right? So in this approach, right, it's very heavily based on the PRA, as many probably know. So there are a lot of the set of events one has to consider, I would say, comes in 2 basic categories. One is those set of events that are derived directly from PRA sequences. You build the PRA, all the events on the PRA sort of above a frequency cutoff, right? Those are licensing basis events that you break into categories based on their frequency: anticipated operational occurrences, design basis events, and beyond design basis events. There's also a fourth item, which is design basis accidents, which sort of completes the set of licensing basis events. And that's a more deterministically based event type, where you take your design basis events, which are those events in the PRA that land between 10 to the -2 and 10 to the -4 per year in frequency. And then you credit only safety related SSCs, and you use that to set the performance of your safety related SSCs, as well as determine what the offsite consequences are relative to regulatory dose limits. So again, it's a risk-informed method. There are deterministic elements to it, and it has this, the PRA sequences and this more deterministic construct of design basis accidents that's a part of it that forms the complete set of licensing basis events that one must consider. But I already mentioned one thing that jumps to the next step, which is SSC classification, right? Because as I said before, like you have to, the design basis accidents are based on crediting only safety related SSC. So how do we come to that determination? How do we decide what the different classifications are? And 1804 has three says three safety categories that it considers. One is safety related, and that's sort of very familiar to what people are probably used to. There's non-safety related with special treatment. It's an augmented safety classification, and then there's non-safety related with no special treatment. And then so there's safety related. We sometimes think it's SR. Non-safety related but with special treatment is NSRST, and then non-safety related with no special treatment we sometimes abbreviate as NST. So I'll use those throughout just to avoid saying the full thing. And safety related components, that's what you rely upon to demonstrate that you can meet your off-site dose limits, right? So you credit those in design basis accidents. You develop your performance requirements based on those sort of conservative accident definitions. And those are most akin to, I think, what people are used to when talking about safety-related SSCs. NSRST is probably the most interesting classification because I think for advanced reactors, we're trying to limit the number of safety-related components in places where you have to apply, the full-on nuclear standards and leverage more, industry best practice. And NSRST is sort of a partway in between safety classification, and what it encompasses is, so for those things that aren't safety related, any SSCs that perform risk significant functions, or any SSCs that are necessary for adequate defense in depth, right? So, and a lot of, when I look at the Xe-100, a lot of the SSCs fall into, of the classic things that we classify that aren't NST, the biggest bucket is going to be the NSRST. So again, safety related, meet your dose limits, only crediting those systems. NSRST, it's anything that's not safety related, but is still risk significant relative to certain risk metrics and is necessary for adequate defense in depth. And then NST sort of covers the rest. And again, I got ahead of myself because I said defense in depth, right? So how do we actually determine that, right? So you can see it's a very coupled process, right? All of these things sort of feed back on one another. So then evaluation of defense in depth adequacy. And there'll be some more examples later on in the presentation that will kind of talk at some of the elements of this. So I'll just kind of talk at a high level here. But essentially, NEI 1804 provides some guidance for, how one thinks about defense in depth from both a plant capability standpoint, for example, not relying on just one SSC in order to ensure safety, right? Especially in the design basis event region, making sure you have multiple layers, right? In sort of a classic defense in depth concept, but also programmatic defense in depth. What programs do you have in place? Are there places where you need augmented quality, et cetera? So it has some, a systematic set of questions and criteria that you have to go evaluate in order to determine, the adequacy of defense in depth. And the one thing I will say, though, is that the criteria in many of the guidance that NEI 1804 goes into, it's not, there are some things that I would say are a little more prescriptive is the wrong word, but it gives like more detailed guidance. But in many cases, it falls back on what's known as the integrated decision-making process. And that's sort of the thread that ties the whole thing together, is there's an integrated decision-making process that you undergo to get the opinions of, the engineering team and the safety analysis and the PRA and licensing, and bring it together, and you come up with a set of, a framework or a set of rules in order to decide what is adequate enough, right? What makes sense for this design. But 1804 gives you sort of the prompts, to go through and ask. So those are the basic elements of 1804. Oh, and just the one final thing is I would say this is sort of an emblematic picture of, what is used in 1804 to help with determining overall design adequacy, and that's the frequency consequence curve. So the frequency consequence curve was built up. So we have frequency on the y-axis here, and then the dose of the exclusionary boundary on the x-axis. And this acceptability line was determined based on, pulling together a bunch of different regulations and different, health goals and everything to basically make what we believe this line to be. And the objective is to keep all of your, sequences to the left of this line. And then this is a tool that you use in order to evaluate various aspects of many of the items that I mentioned previously. One thing to note, staying within this line is not, I would say, the ultimate acceptance criterion. Ultimately, you have to meet regulatory dose limits. I would say it's more of a tool to help, guide your way. Just let me check real quick here. Okay, I saw some chat pop up and make sure there doesn't look like there's anything I have to answer directly. So now I'd like to get into a little bit about what we're up to, and so how we're implementing this process. So I know that was kind of a very fast overview of 1804, and if there's any aspects of what I go through next that aren't clear because of that fast introduction, don't hesitate to ask. My time is somewhat limited. So I'll talk a little, and I'm going to talk at a high level about overall progress, and then these items in bold here that I have noted are ones that I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, and go into some more detail. So one is, I'll call the NEI 1804 process, within an organization itself, right? So NEI 1804 has a methodology that's presented in it, for how to go do all of these items, but that's very different than how you implement it within an organization within the context of an evolving design. And so we have had to develop our approach for how we implement NEI 1804 within the context of the Xe-100 project. We've developed a guideline for how we execute the process, as well as developed an overall approach, including how we interact with what's known as our IDPP, or Integrated Decision-Making Process Panel. And so that's sort of the adjudicating body, an independent adjudicating body that we use. And it's something that's, sort of directed by 1804 that you should use. I think there's a parallel concept in 5069 to basically have oversight over all of the decisions. So I'm going to walk through that a little bit about how we're actually implementing this within the organization. Secondly is, ultimately all the insights, so you classify SSCs, that's great. You go do defense and depth adequacy, that's great. What's really important, what's important is getting the requirements that come out of the process into the design, right? So we're going to come up with things like reliability and capability targets that come out of the PRA, that come out of the safety analysis. You need to feed that into a requirements management system, because that's the language that a design team usually speaks in. You have to flange it up with a systems engineering process. And so, so we've developed some approaches to actually do that, in a methodology for doing that amongst ourselves. And I'll share a little bit about, where we're at with that and what we've been doing with it recently. And I was going to put this one in here, but and I've actually got a slide on it later if I actually go through this quicker than I think, on alignment with principal design criteria. So, as part of developing the 1804 work, you have to come up with essentially what are your safety functions, right? And some of them are required safety functions; those are safety related, and some are not. And I think there's, and then there's the second thing, which is principal design criteria, right? Which is a separate but comparable concept to what you have to develop in 1804. And I think that there's some competing opinions out there. And so with the principal design criteria, there was some work done a number of years ago to develop advanced reactor design criteria in Reg Guide 1.232. And when you look at 1804 and developing all these safety functions, and you look at the principal design criteria, they're kind of trying to do the same thing in certain areas. And so we've worked to essentially align all of our safety functions that are derived out of the 1804 process with principal design criteria. And we submitted a topical report on that recently, or in a process of updating it. But if I have time, I'll get to that. But I'll just note that we've tried to meld those two things together so that we are 1804 influenced in our principal design criteria. A couple other items. So LBE identification, we've gone through multiple rounds and updates of the PRA corresponding to the various design stages. So, nothing too much to report on there, except, making progress and expanding the licensing basis events as we progress through the design and the PRA. Multiple safety analysis rounds, which correspond to that. And we're further developing the requirements and performance characteristics of SSCs based on direct evaluation of all the licensing basis events. SSC classification. So we've gone through multiple rounds of this as well. I would say we started off very judgment-based. We sort of just go through the system breakdown structure, panel, what do we think, right? Start there, just starting point. And then as we've gone on, we've increased the rigor of that, drawing from explicit safety analysis results, PRA, using the processes in 1804 a little more rigorously. We've been focused on the system level right now, but we are very quickly now going to be decomposing that down to the component level, because it's important. Not only it's really important to our design team to understand, of the system, what carve out of that system is actually needing to perform that safety function, so you can really focus the requirements on the system that's important, on the pieces of the system that's important, not you don't want to do the whole system itself. We have done a first round of defense in-depth adequacy. So we've gone through that process, and that's part of our guidelines. So we've developed a guideline for all three of the big pieces of 1804. We've gone through a first round of that. And then the final thing, which is I'm going to get into more detail later, is reliability and capability targets and special treatments. So as part of this process, right, that's sort of how you feedback requirements into the design, is you develop reliability and capability targets based on what you expect SSCs to do during the course of accidents. And then in addition, for special treatments, so I mentioned NSRST, but I didn't define special treatments. Those are basically additional assurances beyond normal commercial practice that you may want to impose to have additional confidence that things like NSRST systems are going to do their job. There's a lot of back and forth, at least within our organization, about special treatments. I think the philosophy, as I understand it, and had a lot of good conversations with Carl Fleming about this, is really you're trying to, with NSRST, you're trying to largely go with industrial best practice, but then sort of have performance-based monitoring, right, in order to assure that it does what you expect it to do. But you can do things like increase, up to codes and standards, up to QA, et cetera. Like, there are multiple options, but really there's a bit of an art in defining the right special treatments. So I'll talk a little bit about where we're headed in that process as well. So these are the three items. Talk about the 1804 process and how we've implemented, a little bit about how we've interfaced this with our systems engineering process, and then talk a little bit at the end about reliability and capability targets. Okay. So 1804 process development. So I have so we have this integrated decision-making process implementation guide. So we wanted to lay out sort of lay out our approach so that as people were going through implementing this process, it could be done in a repeatable way. And when the regulator wants to come in and take a look at what we're doing, say, hey, this is our process. We're calling it a guide, not a procedure right now. We're probably because I would say we're still making soup with respect to developing it. So we wanted some flexibility, but at least we've got sort of the steps down that we're following. And the way that we've worked this is that we have a couple different bodies here that are executing this process. The biggest one is what we call an NEI 1804 implementation team. So there's a separate group of people who are focused on 1804, right? And going and pulling together safety analysis, PRA, engaging with the design team, and really sort of have that as a focus of what they're doing. And we found that was kind of necessary, because 1804 has its own rules and language, et cetera. We needed some people that were kind of focused on that, who could help to translate the PRA, translate the safety analysis, kind of act as intermediaries, right, to help bring the design team along, and make sure that all the right conversations were happening and making sure the right information was getting passed. So that's I would say the core team is myself and several folks from our licensing organization, but also we have people involved from our engineering team, PRA, safety analysis, and operations, essentially playing a part in that implementation. And so we go and execute the process. Again, we do the PRA, the safety analysis, pull together the information, we classify the SSCs, we get together the targets and special treatments, we work with the engineering team, and we sort of document all that. Then we have our integrated decision-making process panel, which has is a voting body that has representatives from all of these groups, and they review two major things. One, we have them review our SSC classification, and in order for it to become official, it has to be approved by that group. And they also review our defense in-depth adequacy. And both of those things cover sort of a wide gamut, and I would say mop up most of the 1804 deliverables. So that team is I'd say largely independent of this implementation team. I think at the beginning there was some overlaps, but now I would say this is an independent body that's going to be reviewing most of this. We also, at this stage, decided to add another layer. We have what's known as a design safety review board. And part of this board is we wanted, so most of the people on the IDPP, I would say, are, line level people, like line level technical people, line level management people. And what we wanted to do was create a line to the CNO, right? So that the CNO has oversight over anything that's, nuclear safety related. And then also, have a board that is representative of more senior technical people, senior management, so that they can be aware of the process and what's going on. So this board cannot change any of the decisions that the IDPP makes, but the idea is we wanted to create a process whereby these folks could formally weigh in, provide their feedback, and then they have accountability to the CNO. And part of the reason for doing that is that, we're not only making design decisions for a plant that's going to, last 60 years, but, hopefully a fleet of them, right? So there's a lot of weight on these decisions. And so we wanted to make sure that all layers of the organization were involved. So that's kind of, the basic overall structure of how we actually execute the process. Let me just look in the chat here to see if there's anything. Okay, I don't see anything right now. Okay, so moving on to the next piece, which is requirements decomposition. At least when I read 1804, I get the sense of it, and as a little bit more on the side of a licensing construct, right? That's the way I see it and read it. But in many ways, it's a design tool, right? The way I tell the team when I'm talking to them is we have two customers internally. We have the license and we have the design. And in the end, it's one customer, but just organizationally, like we have to think about both of those sides of things. And so what we've done also is try to take all of our PRA results, safety analysis results, going through the 1804 process and decompose that into requirements that are usable by the system engineering team. And so what we've done, so this is sort of a very generic and high level picture. And I think people who've, read through some of these documentation in the past, like other 1804 documentation has seen this, that you decompose your safety functions from the most top level things, right? See, these are sort of these top level ones are more fundamental safety functions. Then you start getting down into design specific safety functions. For us, it's retain radionuclides and particles and pebbles, control reactivity, control heat removal, control water steam ingress. But then you can decompose this further, right? Because for the engineering team, they want to know, just tell me what my system has to do, right? And so what we've done, and I'm not displaying it here, but we've expanded this tree down multiple levels, right? To essentially carry this and basically translating the PRA into a set of hierarchical system requirements. So now that we can take and flange this up with our systems engineering process, and this becomes, I would say, the formal mechanism by which we're communicating the results of 1804, back into the design. And it may seem obvious, but I would say it's not found it to be trivial to actually execute that organizationally. So I highlight that as sort of an important thing to think about when executing this process. And so at a high level, the way we're walking through it is, so we have our SSC classification. You have all the safety functions that are identified in the PRA, both the safety related ones, NSRST ones, et cetera. And then we take that and we develop a set of plant and system level reliability and capability targets, right? What are we basically asking? What are we asking these systems to do? What are sort of the success criteria? And then what are some higher level reliability targets? How reliable do we want that whole system to be? But sometimes it's not easy to, I would say, for a designer to action on and create verifiable requirements with targets at that level or requirements at that level. So we'll decompose that further, right? And so this is the piece that, we're kind of at this stage right now, and we're very quickly going to be executing this stage where we're going to be decomposing these higher level reliability targets down into component level targets, trying to focus on the most important components to make sure that, down at the component level, you can do something more with that than we feel like at the system level. But then this all flanges up with our requirements management and interface management processes. Because, as you identify a safety function, so a lot of our required safety functions, the ones that are safety related, we don't need AC power, we don't need a bunch of support systems. But a lot of our safety functions necessary for defense in depth, right? We have defense in depth functions that say, yeah, maintain active cooling, because that's a good thing to do, right? Do that. Well, that needs power, right? So and there are interfacing systems for that. What we're trying to do is work the process into our existing systems engineering processes so that our interface management, process can flow those requirements, more fluidly. We don't want to have 1804 going off and doing its thing where the rest of the requirements development is doing its own thing, right? So we're working to say, how do we have the interface management process actually pass those requirements on sort of automatically, rather than having to sort of do it separately. So there's been a lot of process development. And again, I bring this up because I would say it's been non-trivial to necessarily integrate all of this within a systems engineering framework. But we're starting to see the benefits from doing so now. So I'll move on to the final topic here, which is, and I'll spend a few minutes on this, and then I'm going to leave time at the end for any questions. So reliability targets. So this, and I want to say that this discussion I'm about to go through, I'm going to credit several people that we've talked to that have helped inform this, this thinking. Again, one, I thank Carl Fleming for his many conversations on this topic, as well as some folks at INL who have been working on the reliability integrity management, the ASME Section 11 Division 2. So that we've had many conversations with them, and I would say that, and conversations internally, and so it's been a community effort, I would say, to develop our thinking. So reliability targets, I'll give this as a starting point. So this is a table in NEI 1804, and what this table represents are, this is related to the defense in depth process, and they're essentially guidelines for establishing adequate overall defense in depth. And so what this does is it walks through what are the various layers, right? So the 5 layers of defense. Preventing off-normal operation, controlling controlling AOOs, controlling DVEs, controlling BDVEs, and then off-site, impacts. And then it gives guidance, right, for how, some guidance for how you should think about that and what requirements you should impose. And I would say at a fundamental level, so I'm going to boil this down to be very basic, is essentially keep your within your normal operating transients, keep them within the bounds that you designed to. For your design basis events, keep them within the design basis event region. For beyond design basis events, keep them there, right? So you go through this process of developing the PRA at the beginning, and I part of the reason why I picked this topic to go through, because I believe one of the questions I got last time about this was, hey, you're doing all this stuff with PRA and it's advanced reactors, and there's no data on this stuff. Right? So how can you trust all of it? Well, part of what you try to do is, instead of directly using the PRA results to sort of set reliability targets, you're trying to work backward to say, what am I trying to avoid? And so what we do is say, I've developed my PRA, I've developed my AOOs, my design basis events, my beyond design basis events, and I did it based on the best knowledge I have with regards to frequency. But now I want to make sure they stay there. I don't want my design basis events creeping up into AOO territory, because that sort of unbalances my safety basis, right? So, so what you try to do is say, so that's kind of the basis, a fundamental basis of your targets. If you say, I want to keep things in this region, now I've got something to shoot for how I should be ensuring reliabilities of various systems are maintained. And then in operation, I can monitor that, right? And I can make sure that they are actually living up to that. So I'm going to use this as sort of an example. There are some other ways you can look at this, but this sort of gives me a framework to walk through an example. Okay, so if I go back to the good old frequency consequence chart, right? So on the again, on the y-axis is event sequence frequency, which is coming from the PRA. On the x-axis is the dose, which is coming from your safety analysis and the evaluation of all those events. Try to highlight more brightly here the various regions. So above 10 to the -2 is your AOOs, between 10 to the -2 and 10 to the -4, your DBEs, and then between 10 to the -4 and a frequency cutoff is your beyond design basis events. And we've notionally called things below this event, this 5E-7 level, as incredible events. It's not in 1804, but we had to come up with a term to use when we were talking about it. And let's notionally consider for a moment, I have 2 DBEs. Okay, I'm just making this up right now, but just for the sake of, for example, so 2 DBEs. And so remember what we just mentioned, part of my targets is I want to keep those DBEs there. Right, I used the best available information I had to build the PRA. The frequencies came out in this regime. now if that's going to set my licensing basis, I want to make sure they stay there. I don't want them creeping up. Okay, so again, I'm going to keep them less than frequency of 1e minus 2. What do I do with that? Okay, well, now I can take that and go back to my event trees, right? So I say, all right, I want to keep these event sequence frequencies less than 1e minus 2, right? Now what I can do is take a look at the systems that contribute to that and say, all right, how do I allocate that frequency such that if I keep these systems below this particular reliability, that I will meet that overall target, right? So again, here I'm not directly using a lot of the frequencies in the PRA we've developed. We're sort of working backwards to try to determine what must it be at worst, and then we're using the frequencies in the PRA to say, well, can we make it? Right? Are we going to have an issue with that? How much margin are we showing there? Right? So that's sort of how we leverage the PRA to inform us, but we're not necessarily directly using those results. We're sort of setting a goal and then demonstrating how we meet that goal. All right, so we work backwards from this and we set individual system reliability targets. So again, we do this, we focus on this for safety-related and NSRST systems. NST systems are still, so there are NST systems in the PRA. They're important too. There's a lot of NST systems which, you care about their reliability for normal operations, and that ends up being a driver, particularly for initiating events. Like you're driven by the overall plant capacity factor to have a certain reliability on a lot of these NST systems. And so those targets are driven more by the plant owner requirements than necessarily, anything here. And so it's the NSRST and safety related systems where, we try to allocate these targets to. So we do it at a system level, and then we do it at a component level, right? So then once we understand, what the systems are we have to allocate it to, then we decompose it and look at the components as well. And if we took, look at the most important components in the system and, allocate targets to that. And that's something you can action on, a little bit more. And then based on this, we figure out what kinds of programmatic elements do we need in service testing, in service inspections, maintenance, et cetera, that can give us confidence that we're actually meeting that reliability target. And I mentioned a lot of these conversations came up around reliability integrity management for passive components, right? That's a key lead into it. You need reliability targets for RIM, and that helps to set, what kind of inspection techniques do you need to do and actually be able to verify that requirement. So, so I wanted to put this out here to folks. Sort of our thinking about it is that, again, part of it is from some of the questions that I got last time around, was, we are using the numbers in the PRA to help provide, as a starting point, but then we are setting these targets based on sort of thinking backwards and then understanding the margin that we have. And that sort of margin is something we can track as we evolve the design, to make sure that, we don't run some risk that we're going to immediately get into operation and, we're sort of right at the line with our reliability targets. But the important thing to note is that, like, you judge overall adequacy with integral risk metrics, right? So you could have some reliabilities get, oh, it's not quite what I thought, but some are better. And so in the end, you use these integral metrics to help with, demonstrating that, you're meeting your overall goals. So this is some work we're embarking on now. Actually, we're right in the middle of it. So we'll see what comes out of it, and, can come back some other time and tell you the result, but this is sort of the philosophy that we are heading down. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here. I think I was asked to sort of try to keep it to 40 minutes, just so there's time for questions. So I'll end on this note. So lessons learned in implementing 1804. It's really, really important to have an early approach for interfacing with engineering processes. Right, there's a risk of siloing that's very real, and there's a risk of not being able to get the great insights that NEI 1804 can give, right, if you don't flange up with the engineering processes in the right way, in an early period. So it's really important. Get things into requirements, get them into the requirements management system. That gives, that's the language that the engineering team usually speaks in, and finding a good way of doing that in sort of a graded way as you go from conceptual, preliminary to detailed design. But, it's extremely important, right, for communicating things to the engineering team. For special treatments. So again, just to recall on special treatments, right, this is sort of, enhancements beyond typical industry practices, right, that you may want to oppose. This is particularly important for NSRST systems. I learned a very hard lesson, the need to over-communicate a negative result, right? So we were, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Like, so we were, we went through an iteration of special treatment development, looked through it, didn't identify a lot that we saw was necessary at the time. But people took the absence of something and said, well, you haven't told me yet, so I'm going to be conservative, right? And so then people went and applied a whole bunch of things that, when we said, oh, hold on a second, don't do that. And so, like, with NSRST, I think the philosophy is really like, we're trying to go industrial best practice and add on some stuff, not start at full-on nuclear treatment and walk back, right? And so there's an element of how you communicate that and sort of setting a mindset about NSRST in order to get the in order to get the right outcome, because you can end up with overly burdensome design assumptions early on that you may have to walk back from. Construction permit application, right? So we are leveraging NEI 2107 in building our construction permit application. It's NEI 2107 is it hasn't been endorsed by the NRC yet. I understand they're going through final discussions on it, I think soon. But this basically, for those who are not aware, this basically gives what the proposed content and applications of an NEI 1804 based PSAR, or it's not PSAR, SAR are. So I find it's really good framework, good guidance. There's limited guidance on PSARs. I mean, I think this is from talking with other reactor, but it's sort of a general problem. Like, people are still trying to figure out what is the real line for a PSAR, for a power reactor. And so I would say observation is people have to pick right now, like we have to make our best judgments, but it's good to make some early decisions on that. Because I think we've done some back and forths on, how much PRA do we need? How much NEI 1804 implementation do we need? It's important to think that through and come up with a decent thing to shoot for. Because I think they probably waited a little too late to really formally decide all of that. And so, deciding early, what's the level that you want for the PSAR is important, and then you can flange that up with your design process. And then finally, this is just a couple of thoughts that I'll leave folks with. We haven't done much on this, but I would say it's questions that have come up, but how to interface this with other radiological safety considerations, like normal operations relations and worker protection. And I'll tell you that where this came from is largely in interacting with folks in Canada. We haven't had this question come up on the US side of things, but in Canada, the approaches that are used for, I would say, management systems, I feel a little bit different. They're a little more like cover everything. There's like a holistic management system that's used, and everything kind of falls under one framework. And so we got a lot of questions on, well, you got this 1804 process, it's really great, but like, how do you think about this? I mean, you can't get to an SSC classification for worker protection or normal operation dose at all. Like, it's only for accidents. Like, 1804 is focused on accidents. And so we haven't, this hasn't been, I would say, as much of an, I think on the US side of things, I think there are other regulations that we just follow, but, this is a question that came up in Canada. And I think it's an important question to bring up, because I think we want these technologies to be successful, both domestic and abroad. And so considering, how other regulators look at this is important. So, again, it's something we've started talking about, but I'm throwing it out to the community of other smart people to, just as a consideration. So with that, that is my presentation. So at this point, I will take any questions if folks might have.
There is one. Greg Hedson has asked a question. Can you see it?
Yes, I can. Let me read it. Presumably XE100 incorporates commercial design objectives as well as radiological risk objectives. Do you use this systematic process or a similar one as a framework for incorporating commercial requirements into the XE100 design? So yes, commercial requirements, so we have a top level requirements document that incorporates both, radiological safety objectives as well as commercial objectives. And those basically are a starting point for our requirements management system. And so we'll take, hey, I want to have X% capacity factor, right? And that's a commercial objective. And that's going to flow down to various systems, we'll decompose that and figure out, well, what does that mean for this system, and this system? So yes, we incorporate that into the overall requirements management system.
So there aren't any other questions. I think you've been so clear in everything you said, Kyle, that it hasn't generated many questions, but I'd like to ask along the lines of these.
Marsad, sorry, this is Amir. I have a question, but I'm not good at typing. Do you mind if I ask it as opposed to type it?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So Kyle, that was a great presentation. Thank you very much. Have you guys thought about providing some of these guidance documents that you have provided, that you have developed to ANS to issue as a guidance document?
You said some of the documents that we've developed to work with. I would say at this point, no. I would say I'd have to think about that one. I would say largely right now we're still developing some of that. It's still being worked. But that's not something that we've considered at this moment.
Yeah,
that's an interesting question. I haven't thought about that, so I'll have to take that back to the team.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that you have spent quite a bit of time and money and everything else. So it should be really yours.
Sure.
But in terms of standardization and helping others and making your processes standardized so everybody else can use it and maybe they can improve on it and give it back to you, maybe it's an idea. And then I have a suggestion in terms of your reliability targets.
Yes, sir.
I think that the biggest problem we had when we developed maintenance rule was that we set the targets and then we tried to observe the number of failures. And really most of the numbers are so low that you expected to see no failures. And it's not really practical in many sense. So I'm suggesting perhaps you try to apply the maintenance rule. See if you take your target and develop a maintenance rule program, how many failures should you expect to see for any particular component? So it's again going backwards and trying to translate targets into something tangible so you can observe during operation. And you make sure during operation you're not creating unnecessary burden. We sorted that over the years at the current fleet, but for your design, because you could have some infant failures, it could be of some use.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate that suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. Lana, you have a question?
I do. Kyle, thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. Amir kind of stole my question, but I'll ask it anyway. Kyle, what do you think your approach would be to demonstrate the compliance during plant operation? And I'll expand it a little bit because I very much appreciate your process of somewhat decoupling PRA results and reliability targets, just like you said. So slight deviation does not put you in some sort of non-compliance space. So when we start operating the plant, how do you envision to demonstrate the compliance?
Well,
the licensing commitments?
I will say that, and for one, I definitely recognize the concern about, no observable failures. And I think part of it is, we're getting into that phase next. And other than generically saying, there are monitoring programs, et cetera, that will be put in place, I don't have the detail right now, but essentially it's going to be some degree of monitoring that's going to play a role in it. And I think I have a better answer once we've gone through this and sort of see what we're facing. But that's at a high level, I would say, the philosophy we're taking.
Okay, yes, thank you. And just to expand it just a little bit on Amir's point, it's much easier to demonstrate that, let's say, your maximum flaw size or leakage or something that you can observe.
Yes, right.
Rather than just reliability and E-6 type of.
100%. Yeah. Yes. No. I appreciate the question a little bit more. Yeah. So for things like for passive components, yes, it will have to walk it back to what we can detect, right? And that's what So yeah, for things like passive components and where you're dealing with things like cracks, and yeah, we'll walk it back to that. So agreed.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you.
Dennis Henneke. Dennis, you have a question, please.
Yep, appreciate the conversation. Sometimes Henneke with Hitachi, we've supported the VTR and the LNP application there, and supporting Natrium also. And there are kind of two ways to approach risk-informed licensing. One is to kind of use the PRA to determine your DBEs and the LBEs, and then apply it deterministically. And then the other is through the LNP process. And of course, LNP provides you a much more comprehensive evaluation, as you're probably feeling right now. Complicated is another word. But so the question really comes down to, if you would have applied, say, risk-informed LBE selection or DB selection, and then applied deterministic versus what you're doing now, and what do you think the monetary advantage is for applying LNP versus just using the PRA for the LBE selection?
I may need to follow up with you on the exact meaning of that. I mean, in some ways, I need to make sure I understand the question here. So we are doing sort of, we got the LBEs and we're developing our deterministic accidents from it, right? So I guess that's, in your definition, sort of the risk-informed selection of LBEs. That's what, so even though we have a DBA, you're still calling that being risk-informed, right?
Sure, but you don't have an SRST under a deterministic approach.
Right.
So,
and by using a deterministic approach, like, I guess, you know, the way I think of deterministic approach, I'm thinking about what LWRs do. And like there, I would say it's based on like a set of accidents that don't even make any sense to what we're doing, right? So if I had to do large break loca, for example, you know, I couldn't quantify what the cost impact is exactly, but I can tell you that, you know, that I could definitely see that having very significant impacts on the design, and that's something that we had to consider.
you know, the question was, if you use the PRA to get rid of things like large break loca to determine what your LBEs are.
Yes, right.
To start with, and
Right.
then start it from there. Can you imagine what that would be like compared to LNP?
Using PRA to.
Your LBEs would be the same as they would be for LNP, but now you'd be applying what's in the DBE range deterministically versus the LNP approach.
Okay. Admittedly, I'm struggling to see the difference. I apologize.
Well, that's kind of the point of the question.
Okay. Very sneaky. Right?
It's going to be a subtle difference, right? Because design basis is application is going to apply some conservatism.
Yeah.
But LNP applies NSRST. So
yeah,
there are subtle differences, but what you end up with, none of us knows, but I thought maybe you might have thought about it. So
yeah,
anyways, something to think about.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Let's see, Jim, August, you have your hand up. You also had a question on the chat. Is it the same thing, or
yeah, it's pretty much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing. I apologize. I couldn't find the hand icon here. It took me about 5 minutes to sift through this. But in particular, we do have a guy who I believe works for you, X-Energy, John Fletcher, who has prior PBMR experience. But he's brought up some of these issues, such as the Canadian regulators issue with the definition of special treatments. And frankly, I think we've got resolutions underway in that group that are going to significantly improve upon some of those concerns. So there's a lot of active work going on right now.
Okay.
With 53.1 update, which of course is the same type of reactor to address many of these issues.
Right.
And that deserves to be noted.
No, I appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you.
Yeah, for everybody's benefit, Jim August is the working group chair for the update to 53.1. and he was the working group chair when it was first issued. So a lot of credit for what everybody is ascribing to 53.1 goes to Jim August's efforts over many years. So I want to make sure that credit is given where it's due. So thanks, Jim.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, Prasad, and also Kyle, especially too.
Kyle, in the couple of minutes left, you spoke of plant owner requirements, and I'm thinking that, tell me if I'm right in thinking that you want to keep plant owner requirements out of the licensing basis, right?
100%, yep.
So I'm wondering, do you formally keep track of the requirements management in this way? Because, on the community of practice, we've heard from another advanced reactor where they talk about requirements management hierarchy itself, where the highest points in the hierarchy are associated with meeting regulatory requirements. And many of the others are really just related to making sure that the plant, runs, is constructed and then operates, effectively. So.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I don't remember exactly how our specific system. I mean, it's all in one system. And we've got a basis for all of them, so they can point back to whether or not it's a licensing requirement or a commercial requirement. I don't recall how they're flagged differently, but it's all there.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about the licensing process that you should be able to keep things out of the licensing process if you can do so. And I'm just wondering, is there a strategy that the company has developed in order to, make sure that the licensing requirements are sort of, those that really need to be in effect for.
Yes, every day, 100%. Like that is a key objective. Is we want to put the right set of information that's the most relevant to the safety case in the license, and everything else not.
Well, Kyle, this was an excellent presentation. It was worth waiting for a while for you to provide the update. I invite the others who are participating in advanced reactors, if you're using some of these methods, please do share your knowledge and experience with the rest of the community, so all of us can benefit from what should be something very helpful for the national cause, as it were. So with that, again, Kyle, thank you very much, and
thank you for the opportunity.
We are at the end of the hour, right?
Yep.
Yes. So. Yes. Very good. Thank you all. Thank you, Kyle. Thank everyone for participating, and Prasad for taking care of everything. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Goodbye. Have a nice weekend. Bye.